by the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC, in cooperation with the Renewables Consulting Group. This webinar marks the official launch of the report of the same name published by GWEC in cooperation with RCG, the main author of this report. GWEC is a nonprofit international trade association representing the global wind industry in emerging markets worldwide, while RCG is an expert services and advisory firm supporting the global renewable energy sector. My name is Joyce Lee. I'm head of policy and projects at GWEC, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping rules. So throughout this webinar, you can submit your questions for our panelists using the Q&A function on the Zoom toolbar, and we'll pick up those questions during the panel discussion. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube, and we'll send out a link to the recording as well as to the deck used in today's webinar 24 hours after we conclude. We've also arranged for live translation from English to Vietnamese and Vietnamese to English during this webinar, so you will be able to select your interpretation output using the interpretation button on your Zoom toolbar here. And if you're having any technical issues at any time, you can send us a message in the chat. It bears repeating that we wish to be as discussive as possible during this webinar, so please do make use of that Q&A function to submit your comments and questions during the presentations. With that being said, let's kick off. So Vietnam is a nascent offshore wind market with world-class wind resource and strong fundamentals for growth, which can make it an offshore wind leader in Southeast Asia. Under the current development pipeline, the first true large-scale offshore wind projects are not likely to be connected to the grid until 2026 or later. And the infancy of the offshore wind sector in Vietnam means that policy is still being formulated. And the opportunities are tremendous. A recent study by the World Bank predicted that offshore wind could meet between 5 to 12% of Vietnam's electricity supply needs by 2035, with 11 to 25 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by then. And that's just a fraction of the 160 gigawatts of technical potential identified by the Ministry of Industry and Trade, or MOIT, in Vietnam. So to set the scene, we're going to begin this webinar with opening remarks from Dr. Nguyen Anh Tuan, Director of Renewable Energy Center at the Institute of Energy, and then from Li Ming Xiao, the Head of Asia at GWEC. We'll then be joined by Michael Stevenson, Associate Director at Renewables Consulting Group, for a presentation on the report and the case studies within the report. To help us better understand this landscape and the transition period ahead for offshore wind, we'll then invite Dr. Tuan, Li Ming, and Michael to join us for a panel discussion alongside Maya Malik, the CEO of Lagan Wind and Senior Director at Copenhagen Offshore Partners, as well as Andrew Ho, Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs for Asia Pacific at Ørsted. Before moving into opening remarks, just a quick note that the report on Vietnam's transition to offshore wind auctions is published now in English and Vietnamese and downloadable on the GWEC website or via the QR code here. So with that, I will now hand the floor to Dr. Tuan from the Institute of Energy for his opening remarks. Dr. Tuan, over to you.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah, you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Ok. Xin chào tất cả các quý vị đại biểu tham dự cái buổi hội thảo về cái tương lai cho cái cơ chế đấu thầu điện gió ngoài khơi. Tôi cũng xin rất là ngắn gọn. Nhất là về cái sự cần thiết về xây dựng phát triển đột phá nguồn điện gió ngoài khơi ở Việt Nam, thì như chúng ta đều biết là trong một cái tương lai gần là ngành điện Việt Nam thì ngày càng gặp nhiều thách thức trong cái đáp ứng nhu cầu tăng trưởng kinh tế. Nhu cầu điện đang và sẽ tăng trưởng cao, nguồn năng lượng sơ cấp thì đang cạn kiệt dần, đặc biệt là về dầu, khí và một phần có thể dẫn đến phải cái nhập khẩu nhiên liệu. Thì cái xu hướng phát triển năng lượng tái tạo trên thế giới, trong đó có điện gió ngoài khơi, là một trong những cái giải pháp đột phá mà cùng với cái xu thế phát triển và sự quyết tâm của chính phủ, thì cái ngành năng lượng Việt Nam đang có một cái sự chuyển dịch nhanh chóng với sự tăng trưởng vượt trội của năng lượng tái tạo trong cơ cấu nguồn điện những năm 2019-2020. Thì đặc biệt cái ngành năng lượng của Việt Nam đang ở trong một cái thời điểm quan trọng, quyết định đến cái chiến lược phát triển trong cái thập kỷ tiếp theo đặc biệt là cái nguồn tận dụng các nguồn năng lượng từ năng lượng tái tạo, và cái đó đã được thể hiện rõ trong các cái nghị quyết của Trung ương, ví dụ như nghị quyết 55 về định hướng chiến lược phát triển năng lượng quốc gia của Việt Nam đến 2030, tầm nhìn đến 2045. Trong đó có nói với cái mục tiêu tức là phải xây dựng các cái chính sách hỗ trợ cơ chế đột phá trong phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi gắn với triển khai thực hiện chiến lược biển của Việt Nam. Thế thì về cái tiềm năng điện gió thì chúng ta cũng biết là đã có các cái với hơn 3.000 km bờ biển bán kính trong vòng bán kính từ 5 đến 100 km, Việt Nam đã có rất nhiều cái tiềm năng thuận lợi để phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi. Thì các cái nghiên cứu đánh giá của các cái cơ quan quốc tế cũng như ở trong nước, ví dụ như đánh giá của Viện Năng lượng, của Ngân hàng Thế giới, của cơ quan năng lượng Đan Mạch và một số các cái đánh giá sơ bộ của các cái tổ chức cá nhân khác đều cho thấy rằng là cái tiềm năng kỹ thuật cho điện gió ngoài khơi của Việt Nam là rất lớn. Con số nó có thể dao động trên 100 gigawatt, trong đó đặc biệt là tập trung ở cái khu vực Nam Trung Bộ và khu vực Nam Bộ là chiếm tỷ trọng lớn nhất, có một phần ở khu vực Bắc Bộ và khu vực Bắc Trung Bộ. Ngoài ra các cái nghiên cứu cũng đã chỉ ra thì các cái đặc thù, tức là điện gió ngoài khơi móng cố định và điện gió móng nổi. Thế thì trong quá trình thúc đẩy các cái dự án triển khai các cái điện gió ngoài khơi này thì cái việc đánh giá chúng ta vẫn sẽ có thể tiếp tục tiến hành đánh giá để có được con số chính xác tiếp theo. Tuy nhiên các cái cơ quan quản lý nhà nước, các cái đơn nhà phát triển cũng như các cái đơn vị tư vấn đang gặp một số các cái khó khăn vướng mắc trong việc quản lý, thiết kế các cái dịch vụ cần để thúc đẩy phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi, đặc biệt là cái cơ chế hỗ trợ cho điện gió ngoài khơi mà thông lệ quốc tế hiện nay đang áp dụng, đó là FIT, tức là giá Feed-in Tariff hoặc là FIT Premium hoặc là đấu thầu. Trong cái điều kiện mà bất định về tương lai, về cái nhu cầu, về cái chi phí, về an ninh năng lượng, về giá trị gia tăng cũng như là về sự chuyển dịch năng lượng. Thế thì với cái tình hình như vậy thì tổ chức năng lượng gió toàn cầu GWEC có phối hợp hôm nay tổ chức một cái hội thảo với cái chủ đề là chuyển đổi đấu thầu điện gió ngoài khơi ở Việt Nam trong tương lai, cái bài học thực tiễn và kinh nghiệm quốc tế, nhằm mục đích là cung cấp một cái nhìn tổng quan về cơ chế đấu thầu cho điện gió ngoài khơi, các cái bài học kinh nghiệm từ 6 thị trường quốc tế đi trước chúng ta. Báo cáo cũng đã đưa ra được các cái khuyến nghị chi tiết cụ thể với một cái lộ trình rõ ràng cho thị trường điện gió ngoài khơi, mà sau đây thì chúng ta cùng sẽ được nghe tác giả của cái nghiên cứu này trình bày. Thì tôi có được cái vinh dự là tham gia góp ý cho cái báo cáo này trong cái quá trình soạn thảo, và theo cái đánh giá của tôi thì tôi có đánh giá cao cái giá trị mang lại của cái báo cáo này. Nó sẽ hỗ trợ cho cái quá trình định hướng một cái khung pháp lý thúc đẩy cho cái điện gió ngoài khơi của Việt Nam. Mặc dù còn rất nhiều là việc phải làm, như là phần phải cân nhắc, cần phải đánh giá trước khi có thể định hình một cái cơ chế đấu thầu rõ ràng, minh bạch và chi tiết hóa cho điện gió ngoài khơi. Tôi cho rằng cái báo cáo đã có một cái đóng góp bước đầu rất quan trọng và rất tốt cho cái lộ trình phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi của Việt Nam. Thì với cái mong muốn học hỏi kinh nghiệm của những thị trường đi trước, chúng ta sẽ cùng nhau nghe cái bài trình bày sau đây và sẽ có những cái thảo luận đóng góp đề xuất cho các cái bước tiếp theo. Thì tôi xin chúc cho một cái hội thảo tốt đẹp, và như một cái câu Pháp ngữ người ta hay nói, trong trường hợp này người ta hay dùng gọi là bông văng, tức là thuận buồm xuôi gió. Xin cảm ơn các bạn. Xin hết.
Many thanks, Dr. Tuan, for your kind and positive remarks about the report. And I think you really clearly outlined this kind of crossroads moment which Vietnam faces now for its next phase of offshore wind. I'm going to hand it to my colleague Li Ming Xiao, who is head of Asia at GWEC, for her opening remarks on this topic now. Over to you, Li Ming.
Thank you, Joyce. And also, I want to echo Joyce on the big applause on Dr. Tuan for giving us the very useful and very good comments of this report, and also suggestions on our different policy recommendations of this report. GWEC started to work on the offshore wind market in Vietnam in the middle of 2019. Back at the time, we launched our first offshore white paper and also did the first offshore roundtable. At that point of time, there were lots of questions and doubts to us saying, is this too early? Is offshore wind too early for the Vietnamese market? And the past 2 years, I think what has happened really answered that question. We've seen offshore wind gaining momentum on the government side. We've also very happy to see that for the first time this year, the PDP-8 is having a separate offshore target. Although PDP-8 is still being finalized, but we still have high hope and high confidence that this target will be kept in the PDP-8. And this really reflects what Dr. Tuan just said, the Vietnamese government's resolution into energy transition, which is also captured in the Resolution 55 published last year. And in the beginning of this year, or end of last year, we commissioned this report to RCG. Part of the reason is that we know the government is thinking and planning of the designing of the auction for offshore. And auction is a good mechanism in terms of finding the lower price, finding the cost of the technology. It also is a good mechanism for government to keep control the size and the overall scale of the sector, comparing with the FIT. But on the other hand, offshore technology is also a complicated technology. There are lots of lessons and experiences from other markets in designing the auction for offshore. And that's why we're doing this report, which kind of collect all the major offshore markets on their experiences and their lessons learned on the auction design. The other issue that we were very much paying attention is the transition design of these different auction mechanisms. As we've seen now, there's no real offshore already being installed in Vietnam. So how to really start or how to really transit into a proper or a smooth auction design is a key purpose of this study. And we hope that from today's launch webinar and also from the report, we really can offer some good kind of suggestions to the government and to all the audience, to all the industry people who are really paying attention and having high hopes to this sector. Without further ado, I'll hand over back to Joyce and also look forward to Michael to really share the findings of this report.
Thank you so much, Li Ming. I think we're very eager to hear from all of our panelists. So let's move swiftly on to the presentation, and we should have the second half of this webinar dedicated to discussion. We've seen a few questions come in so far, but of course, as Michael is presenting the findings from this report, please do feel free to make use of that Q&A panel and include any comments or questions for him or the rest of the panel. So with that, I'm going to welcome Michael to the stage. Michael is Associate Director at the Renewables Consulting Group, and we'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the attendees and participants on this webinar. It's been a great opportunity for us to work on this project, and it's just echo all the comments of the introduction so far in terms of how exciting the market is in Vietnam and the opportunity that lays ahead. So if we move on to the first slide. So just to give an introduction, I'll try and talk through the report, but I would heartily encourage you to download the report. There's a lot more detail in that written report than I can cover in the allocated 15 minutes today. But hopefully what I can do today is talk through the key conclusions and also talk through some of the give some guidance to how to use the report and how to look at some of the figures. So as we've already heard, Vietnam is at this crossroads for its policy design, and auctions are likely to be a key consideration. Obviously, there is a feed-in tariff mechanism available for renewables at the moment, including nearshore wind, but there will be obviously an appetite to transition to an auction. So how can Vietnam really leverage the lessons learned from other markets in transitioning to auctions in the past, and how can we apply those lessons in the context, critically, of Vietnam going forward? Before I dive into the detail, I would just like to just make sure we're all on the same page regarding the types of auction that we're discussing here. So the two main types of auction or sort of mechanism for offtake in offshore wind that we've seen so far can be categorized broadly as either one-stage auctions or two-stage auctions. So one-stage auctions are the like of Denmark, so site exclusivity and offtake all wrapped into one bundle and secured through a single auction process. Or two-stage auctions where site exclusivity and leases are potentially secured either through auction, such as in the UK, the recent round 4 allocation, or through other means, and then transition to the second stage, which is an offtake purely secured through auction, such as in the UK, the contracts for different scheme. And I'll touch on the UK in more detail later. But for the purposes of this report, we were really focusing on that offtake auction, so either the one-stage auction or the second of the two-stage auctions, and that's really the main focus of our report. So if we move on to the next slide, the methodology for the report, we undertook a literature review of sort of policy announcements, policy reports, and of obviously the policies themselves in key markets, but also leveraged our own experience across these markets, helping clients deliver services and particularly in offshore wind. So the 6 offshore wind markets that were selected represent different maturities of market in offshore wind, so different scales of development and different scales of capacity installed, but also different approaches as well in terms of how they've gone about approaching the auctions and also how they've transitioned. So we felt these 6 countries or these 6 markets really represented a holistic view of the different approaches that can be viewed. So the 6 markets were the UK, Germany, Denmark, France, Taiwan, and the Netherlands. Alongside this, we also undertook stakeholder interviews, which were enabled by GWEC, and these were really critical in ensuring that our experience and our literature review was applied in the context of the Vietnam market. So we interviewed 2 stakeholders in each of the 4 groups shown on this slide. So a minimum of 2 from industry, and that includes both developers themselves who are interested in the Vietnam market or have active projects, as well as the supply chain or the future supply chain and interested parties, the fishing community and representatives of fishing industry groups in Vietnam, the government or government advisors and think tanks who are advising government on the policy in Vietnam, and then the investment community as well, and particularly those investors who are financing renewable energy projects already in Vietnam and understanding how they view offshore wind as an investment opportunity and the risks therein. So without further ado, I'll move into the case studies of the 6 different markets. But just before I sort of dive too deeply into that as well, I just wanted to cover the different transitions that were studied. So we have these 3 different types of transition that we've essentially concluded from the different markets. So whilst there are no neat ways nothing will be perfect, but this is the neatest way we can find to categorize the different transitions. And we've seen 3 main types of transition. So the first being an overlap, where the original policy mechanism that supports renewable energy or offshore wind overlaps with the auction mechanism directly, and perhaps developers or projects have access to both and can make a choice between the 2 depending on how they feel. And this normally involves a gradual reduction in the price level of that original support mechanism to ease into an auction. We also see stepping stone transitions. So this is where fully competitive price-based auctions are introduced, but through some sort of stepping stone mechanism. So this could be a different type of mechanism to the original mechanism before an auction, or it could be some sort of hybrid auction, for example, one that isn't decided on price, but is decided on other factors, and the price is set at a level by the administrator of the auction. And then finally, and perhaps a lesson learned is certainly one of no transition. So that can be one where competitive auctions are used immediately to support offshore wind without a prior support mechanism, or it could be one where the previous mechanism is stopped and a full competitive auction is then immediately put in place. We've seen more of the former than the latter, but it is possible for the latter to happen. So yeah, let's move into then the different markets. So the UK is a really interesting case study. And before I go into the full details of the UK, just to look at the chart on the left-hand side. So we have produced each of these infographics for each of the markets. So each of the 6 markets in the report, you'll see one of these infographics. And this is to show on the left-hand side, the original support mechanism for renewable energy and offshore wind. And on the right-hand side is the auction mechanism. So you'll see the left-hand side stops at a certain point, and you can see the amount of overlap in time and also in where the industry was in terms of installed capacity when auctions were introduced and when the transition period was introduced. So we hope those are useful ways of representing that. So in the UK's example, you can see that we had the Renewables Obligation Scheme set up in 2002, and that helped support, over 4 gigawatts of capacity, offshore wind capacity, was installed by the time that FIDA, which is an acronym used by the UK, but essentially a transition scheme auction mechanism before going into the full auction, which is the contracts for difference CFD allocation rounds, which are shown on the right-hand side. Now, the FIDA process, as it's known, was somewhat controversial in terms of, as you can see on the right-hand side, the chart shows that the awarded price of projects in that scheme. Obviously, not everything is perfect, and obviously there was some discussion about the price that those projects were awarded at. However, what it did do was enable the UK to have a bit of time to refine and confirm the full CFD auction mechanism. And you can see that that's been a real success in terms of bringing the awarded prices down and also keeping the flow of capacity installed. So the capacity has gradually increased year on year, which has largely been a success, I would say. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So yeah, this is just an example then of a stepping stone transition in the UK, so where the FIDA was used. And one of the key case studies from the UK is the separation of technologies in the contracts for difference, and this is one that we've highlighted in the report. So different technologies are split into groups known as pots, and these technologies are generally at the same level of maturity and therefore seeking the same level of price. And what that enables is essentially you to use one mechanism to support multiple technologies at different maturities. In the past, that's been, for example, offshore wind being separated from onshore wind and other renewables. And in the future, we're seeing in the UK floating wind being separated from fixed, potentially, to allow floating to be supported actively through the CFD mechanism. So if we move on to the next slide. So in Germany, you can see, again, a transition here from a feed-in tariff to a contracts for difference scheme. And yeah, if you just flick forward, actually, then you'll see I've highlighted here the overlap transition that we've highlighted. So there was obviously some, this is perhaps not the cleanest overlap transition because it's not quite a like-for-like comparison in terms of the projects having access to both the auction and the FIT, but certainly there was a grace period essentially for the projects that had access to the FIT to enable them to still have access, retain that access whilst the auctions were still ongoing. So there was an overlap between those two policies, and it was a gradual change rather than a sudden stop and leave anyone without access to a support mechanism. So if we move on to the next slide. In Denmark perhaps the earliest adopter of offshore wind auctions and the real front runner of these markets. And back in 2004, they held their first offshore wind auction. Now, actually, the sort of case study here is around the open dialogue, and in those early auction rounds, actually, there were very low participation rates. So only one bidder was active in the Anholt tender, and only 2 bidders for the Rodsand 2 tender. And obviously, that's in modern day terms, that's very, very light. Obviously, that is you would hope for more competition for the auction to have full effect. So Obviously, there are a multitude of reasons, and it would be overly simple to say this was the sole reason for that lack of participation, but certainly the early tenders with very little consultation or negotiation with then Horns Rev 3 moved in later had a much greater interest, and that perhaps is correlated to the fact that there was this clearer and open consultation for that tender, and that gave more comfort to developers to participate and pre-qualify. So if we move on to the next slide. In France, this is one of essentially a no transition, certainly. So there was no offshore wind installed when the first auction was run back in 2011, 10 years ago. And actually, we still see there's only 2 megawatts of offshore wind capacity installed. And this is certainly an example where, again, there's a multitude of reasons for this lack of installed capacity and some of the teething issues that France has faced. But one of those is certainly the fact that we went straight to auction in France. And then the second that we've highlighted as a lesson learned is this local content requirement. So in the first few auctions, local content had a very, very prominent role in the auction criteria, a 40% weighting, which with no industry and no supply chain to speak of at that time was perhaps too heavy, despite such sort of good prices in developer terms, but bad prices in government terms, which then needed to be renegotiated later. If we move on to the next slide. So yes, just to highlight there, the chart on the left shows no transition. There's no chart in terms of, there's just one arrow. It was just competitive auctions from the start, and that's definitely a contributing factor to the lack of installed capacity in the last 10 years since that first auction. Okay, on to the next slide. So Taiwan, the only sort of Asia Pacific market that we studied so far, but certainly an interesting one in terms of the transition. You can see on the left-hand side there was, but I do think actually it's worth highlighting. It's really a classic example, or almost a case study in itself, in terms of those initial pilot schemes, smaller demo projects being supported through more capital grant type schemes, then moving to a feed-in tariff, which is then supported, and so it hasn't necessarily supported installed capacity yet, but nearly 4 gigawatts of projects have now secured offtake through that feed-in tariff and are in development or in construction. And so that's been great to get that scale up before then moving to competitive auctions, which we're seeing in what's known as round 3 in the zonal development rounds. And the case study here is really on that sizable volume and the initial stage of high feed-in tariff support. And I think the transition to highlight here is that round 2, which had the 2 types of auctions. So initially a selection process, which wasn't competitively tendered in terms of price, but was decided on other factors in terms of deliverability, really, of projects, and the quality of the developers themselves to deliver those projects. And then also at the same time, after that, running a competitively bid price-based auction. And now we're moving into full sort of price-based auctions going forward. So if we move on to the next slide. So the final market that we studied was the Netherlands. And again, this is a flow chart that, again, we've produced for each of the 6 markets. So this just shows generally in high level terms the steps that are taken for the policy. So hopefully that will be a useful guide for the readers. And here the lesson learned, or the case study here, is that transparency and certainty in the timelines and the capacity target. So auctions in the Netherlands were introduced in 2011 following an initial feed-in premium scheme for offshore wind, which had supported a certain level of offshore wind, but really it was that certainty that the Dutch government gave to the industry back in 2014, which was almost a 10-year time horizon to deliver auctions and deliver offshore wind. And that's been replaced recently with another 10-year target. And I think the key thing here and the key takeaway is how what they've said would be done has been done and has been delivered. And I think the developers themselves who've won the auctions have then gone on to deliver and commission projects in the same timescales that were targeted, which has been a great success in terms of giving that long-term vision, long-term security that's needed in policy. So if we move on to the next slide. So this is just a summary here of all the original starting mechanism and the final mechanism, and then the transition period. And you can see there we've got mostly examples of stepping stones, one no overlap, and also one with an overlap. All of them, potentially you could argue a case for some of them being overlap or stepping stone, but I think we felt these were the best fits of the different transition periods. But I suppose the key takeaway here is certainly that France, being the one with no overlap, still only secured 2 megawatts of installed capacity. So some transition period is generally the lesson that we've learned is a way of securing that certainty and ensuring supply and install capacity. So if we then move on to I think the final slide. So these are the summary recommendations, and again, I would really urge you to go into the report and dive into much more detail in terms of the recommendations. And I would also say that these recommendations, we sort of started them, but they really flourished when they were taken forward by GWEC, and also other interested parties then had a chance to contribute. So these aren't just sort of our views, these are hopefully a more widely representative view of recommendations, and I think that gives them more power and credibility. So on the left hand side, you'll see certainly that we produced this arrow style diagram, again sort of what we see maybe the transition happening for Vietnam, and we again see that we would really recommend that feed-in tariff is kept in place and supports up to sort of 4 to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind projects, gaining access to that to allow not only that certainty in the supply chain and learnings to be had through the developing that industry, but also that gives time for Vietnam to really make sure that the auction is designed in the future in the right way. So undertaking that stakeholder consultation and undertaking those design studies as well. There's other factors in there as well in terms of that were touched on in the report, for example, ensuring that the PPA itself is bankable and that developers will be wanting to participate in those auctions, and giving recommendations for other studies, and also how much notice is needed to be given to stakeholders. But in general, there's those 4 key themes presented on this slide, and I think really the left-hand chart is a nice snapshot of what our recommendation is for the transition for Vietnam. So I believe that's my final slide. So I'll hand back to Joyce.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a whirlwind but comprehensive view of the substance in the report, and just a taster, I think, of all the lessons that are contained in the report. And I would highly encourage those on the call today to download the report. It's free on the GWEC website, and we have with RCG's work, we have much more contained in the report in terms of telling the policy story, connecting that to the impact on installations in each of these 6 geographies, and then outlining what the takeaways might be for developing markets and emerging markets for offshore wind. So with that, I am going to welcome now to the virtual stage all of the panelists to please turn on their cameras and join us again. We have joining Dr. Tuan, Li Ming, and Michael, Maya Malik, the CEO of Lagan and Senior Director at Copenhagen Offshore Partners, as well as Andrew Ho, Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs of APAC at Ørsted. So I'm just going to take this screen share down, which will allow us to see each other more clearly. Perfect. I think let's hear from Maya and Andy first, since we haven't heard from either of you yet. When we're looking ahead at this offshore wind development in Vietnam in the next decade, one challenge has been mentioned a few times already, which is the expiry of the current offshore wind, or the intertidal nearshore wind feed-in tariff in November of this year. What are your perspectives when you start to think about December 2021 onward? What should be ahead in the next stage of transition in order to ensure that investment can continue and deployment can stay on track? Maya, let's start with you, and then we'll move to Andy.
Thanks, Joy. I guess I'll just start with saying, so we think Vietnam has really good fundamentals and a huge potential for true offshore wind. And we are very committed to this market, but it needs to be recognized that we're still at a very early stage. So we're still conducting our first offshore site surveys, and we think we are 5 years or so away from the first true offshore wind farm being in the water. And that's all things going well. So from our perspective, for the Vietnam market, the preferred model is to first start with early pilot projects and an initial feed-in tariff, and allow industry and government the time to solve the issues we need to sort out: permitting, infrastructure, supply chain, and also financing issues. Then I would just say I'd like to compare it with Taiwan, where we have been active in the early stage of the market. And here, when we were participating in auctions, we had an established legal framework, and our projects were much more mature. So by the time we were bidding, government had established specific laws and departments dedicated to offshore wind. Our projects had approved EIAs. We had done our surveys, and we had nearly 4 years of wind data. And I think most importantly, there was already one commercial scale project that had closed international financing. So we knew it was possible to finance the Taiwan PPA when we were bidding. And then I guess back to Vietnam, I guess, yeah, if we were to rush into an auction phase, and it depends as well what the commitments required at the point of auction would be. I think for us, we would be quite concerned, mainly because there's no precedent projects, and we are still have a lot of development risks. So it would just be for us very hard to confidently price a project at this point in time. Thanks.
Maya, thanks for sharing the update on your project developments as well. It's really interesting. Andy, over to you on what could be next for the transition stage in Vietnam's offshore wind sector.
Thank you, Joyce. And yeah, I think Maya has really captured a lot of the same things that are on our mind as well. I think when we think about Vietnam, we know it has a great offshore resource. I think from that alone, the numbers would look good in terms of what offshore wind can deliver to Vietnam, and not in terms of the amount of green power that can be delivered over the next 10 years as it seeks to decarbonize its activities and really take on the learnings or the actions that Resolution 55 has started. And I think for us, we are starting to see in Vietnam the recognition of what offshore wind can do. We are hearing good messages from our stakeholders in government about the benefits that can be wrought, not only in terms of the green power, but in terms of some of those wider economic benefits that will come later down the line. But as Maya says, it is a complex project. There are lots of moving parts that have to come. It will take time to go and deliver. And I think what a feed-in tariff will do is act as that sort of place for projects to get set up, for that initial momentum to come into the market, so that we know it can be done, and then we can go ahead and do it in some better conditions that then allow us to succeed later in auctions. I think Michael presented the case for France, where if you go straight off the bat with an auction design, it may not work if the framework is not there. And I think that is something that still does need to be matured in Vietnam. So I know it's the Olympics are starting tomorrow, so the thing in my head is perhaps that maybe this isn't a 100-meter sprint to auctions. It may take a few more laps of the track before we get there, but it's certainly not a marathon either from our side.
That's very clear, Andy. And I think the message around cost recovery, certainty to manage the development risk has been really brought out strongly by both those perspectives. Stepping back, I think we've spoken about the resource potential, the world-class wind resource, which is off Vietnam's coastline, and the benefits associated with that. When we look at the current PDP 8, which is still in draft version, we have a 2 gigawatt offshore wind target by 2030. We have seen last year that roadmaps released by the Danish Energy Agency as well as World Bank are setting high case scenarios for offshore wind growth as high as 10 gigawatts by 2030. So I'd like to direct this message to Dr. Tuan and ask what are the kind of challenges or barriers that are sitting between a 2 gigawatt scenario versus a 10 gigawatt scenario?
Vâng, cảm ơn. Tôi xin có lẽ trả lời bằng tiếng Việt cho nó dễ hơn. Là như chúng ta được biết thì mục tiêu phát triển của điện gió ngoài khơi thì nó cũng nằm trong một cái giải bất động. Thế thì hiện nay thì đang chúng ta thấy là đang đề xuất là 2 gigawatt, có thể tăng lên đến 3 hoặc 4. Mặc dù là các cái cơ quan các cái đề xuất nghiên cứu trước đây thì cũng đặt một cái mục tiêu rất là lớn là có thể đến 10 gi. Thì chúng ta giữa mục tiêu và đến cái hiện thực, tức là khi chúng ta tiến hành một cái cụ thể, một cái kế hoạch hóa cụ thể của sơ đồ 8, thì chúng ta cũng phải cân nhắc đến nhiều các cái yếu tố vấn đề như là kỹ thuật, yếu tố giá cả, cái khả năng phát triển hỗ trợ của các cái sở hạ tầng, cũng như là các cơ quan, các cái cơ chế chính sách, cũng như là các cái cơ quan nó phải là đã có được ở trên cho được chuyện để chúng ta thúc đẩy được cái phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi. Nên là cái mặc dù là chúng ta được biết là chúng ta chưa có cái điện gió ngoài khơi thực sự gọi là còn xa bờ, thì chúng ta vẫn đang trong giai đoạn gọi là tìm hiểu kinh nghiệm. Thì như hôm nay chúng ta cũng thấy được có những cái học hỏi được những cái kinh nghiệm nhất định trong cái cơ chế chính sách. Về chính vì vậy mà các cái cơ quan mà tôi nghĩ rằng làm các cái hoạch định chính sách và lên kế hoạch dài hạn cũng rất thận trọng trong cái vấn đề này. Thì cái giả thiết mà tôi nghĩ rằng là cái giả thiết đầu tiên là cái cơ sở hạ tầng, tức là cái cơ chế chính sách cơ sở hạ tầng là phải có đầy đủ thì mới có thể thúc đẩy được. Thứ hai nữa là cái sự cạnh tranh của gió ngoài khơi. Tôi nghĩ rằng là nếu như cái khả năng cạnh tranh của gió ngoài khơi nó thực sự được chứng minh rằng là nó có thể hoàn toàn cạnh tranh được với cả gió trên bờ, thì tôi nghĩ rằng không có cái ngăn cản nào mà để chúng ta có thể phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi nhiều hơn nữa. Tuy nhiên, cơ sở hạ tầng của chúng ta và cái gọi là cái nội địa hóa, cái tỷ lệ nội địa hóa của chúng ta cũng chưa rõ ràng. Cái khả năng cung cấp của chúng ta tham gia vào cái chuỗi cung ứng cũng chưa được rõ. Cho nên là một cái con số tôi đánh giá rằng là 2 gi thì là con số tương đối gọi là thấp. Và để mà có thể đẩy lên được 10 gigawatt thì chúng ta phải có thành lập được một cái đơn vị chuyên trách, mà có lẽ vấn đề này chúng ta sẽ trao đổi tiếp theo sau đây. Và thứ hai nữa là cái tiến bộ khoa học công nghệ của điện gió ngoài khơi nó thực sự nó cạnh tranh được với cả các cái nguồn năng lượng tái tạo khác, thì cái mục tiêu 10 g cũng hoàn toàn có thể. Xin hết.
Thank you, Dr. Swan. That's an optimistic but also pragmatic view, I think, of the situation. And you've highlighted a lot of barriers which require multiple resources and multiple agencies to be coordinating with each other on legal frameworks, infrastructure, transmission build-outs. So a task force is a great idea, and I know we'll pick that up with you after this webinar. I'd like to look at things from the investor and industry perspective as well. So when we look at the next wave of procurement, whether that's a transition scheme or whether that's an auction, what sort of financial and technical capabilities should developers be bringing to ensure that projects can be delivered on time and to high standard? And Michael, perhaps we can start with you to answer this from the kind of qualification perspective and how this was reflected in the case studies in the report. And then we can move to Maya and Andy. Michael, over to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I think what we've seen in those case studies is this pre-qualification phase has been introduced in a lot of markets as they've matured. Obviously, the case study I gave in Denmark of only 1 or 2 developers being able to or wishing to participate in those auctions, gives you less choice. And I think we've seen that those markets, as they've matured and as the interest increases, we've seen pre-qualification criteria be critical. I think for me, it's what we've seen is those more established developers with both the financial credibility, but also the offshore wind experience in other markets, bringing that to to a new market such as Vietnam is critical, and so having some framing around that can be really important. But also, I do think we should be careful not to overweight that, in the sense that partnering and being able to bring on local companies and local developers as well. And we've seen that particularly across the APAC region. We're seeing a lot of partnering of perhaps you'd call them European or global energy companies partnering with more local energy and renewable energy companies. And I think being able to, for those offshore wind companies with that global experience, being able to bring their credibility and resources to partner with those local companies and essentially use that together to qualify for auctions is one of the the best practices we've seen, I think, and ensures that it's a symbiotic relationship rather than just sort of external companies coming in versus local companies getting squeezed out. So I'd say that would be the main learning, I think.
Thanks, Michael. And I think Maya is in a great position in her position with Lagan to speak about that partnership building aspect. Maya, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I think I guess I'll just start with a comment just about new markets in general. It's quite interesting because we find a tendency to underestimate the effort and the investment behind offshore wind. It can sometimes get lumped with, renewables and solar and onshore, and just gets missed actually how huge and complex these projects are and how they really require niche skills. So the reality is they cost multiple billions of dollars, and they're more on par with the thermal power plant projects. And the developers need to be really very technically experienced and able to finance, have the financial muscle to pull these projects off, and also sustain these very long development periods before they see any return. And yeah, of course, we really benefit from the local knowledge on how to navigate planning, as well as tap into local resources and supply chain, etc. And so we see a lot of value in collaborations, like in the supply chain, and also on ownership investment level for projects to succeed. But yeah, I think overarching behind it must sit somebody that is technically competent and financially capable. And I think we really saw, just referring back again to Taiwan, that their early offshore wind projects were delayed, and it wasn't until they brought in the international experienced developers that the market and industry really took off.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. Andy, any comment from your side?
Yeah, I think it's really important for the first generation of projects, to really be successful in any new market. It's really got to make an impression that, that it can be deployed, that it does work. And I think, yeah, it will take an experienced developer or party to come in to demonstrate that. And I think luckily, we're now in a state where, Vietnam is part of the global market where there is lots of that experience available. So it's a question of, how do you bring it in? How do you attract that experience to come in and show that success, show it to others in the area? And I think there was a comment about partnerships earlier, where I think we do see this a lot now in new markets. The sort of combination of someone who's got that global experience and then someone who's more local and on the ground who can help integrate that experience into the market. We ourselves have done that in Japan in this round of auctions, where we partnered with local developers and local companies to go and hopefully deliver the first wave of projects in Japan, and same again in Taiwan there as well. So we think it's definitely key that the first round of projects really goes off well, and I think being able to show that and being able to bring that experience into market is the thing that I would add to the conversation.
Thanks, Andy. I think we can start drawing from some of the questions which have cropped up in our Q&A panel, and thank you to the audience for being so engaged and participating in this launch. We have a question about management of offshore assets and management of the auction process. So someone has asked about the lesson that the Crown Estate, for instance, can reflect for Vietnam on having a state-owned company managing offshore assets. Let's talk a little bit about the management of a potential auction process or a transition scheme. Vietnam has local, provincial, national governments. I'll throw this out to perhaps Li Ming, Dr. Tuan, and then others who may want to answer. Where do we need greater coordination across these different levels of government to streamline the project development, consenting, and consultation process? Li Ming, we'll start with you first.
Sure. I think that question about like who should be the coordination body for the auction, whether it's like national level or provincial level, that's a really good question. We've seen similar discussion or similar kind of thinkings or planning of the government for the onshore wind auction about like moving the auction to the provincial level. But I think offshore is really a different game. And from all the different markets that we've seen, offshore is far more complicated in terms of the use of the seabed, in terms of lots of other things which really need a higher level government body for coordination. And this is also, if we look at Taiwan, where we actually are also in the process of talking to the Taiwan government to say that, okay, you really need above ministry type of like coordination body to really help to smooth out lots of like issues to really coordinate between different ministries to move things to really smooth out the different development challenges, which if we look at the current situation, if auction is going to be in the future, the kind of like mechanisms to allocate the project, to decide the procurement process and to determine the level of like remuneration, then I think it really need a higher level body to kind of coordinate different parts of the government to ensure the smoothness of the project development at a later stage. But I think Dr. Tuan is probably a better person to answer this question. I'll just maybe hand over to Dr. Tuan.
Vâng, tôi nghĩ rằng tôi cũng đồng ý với cái bà Liên Minh về cái sự cần thiết của một cái tổ chức từ trung ương, vì tôi chỉ muốn bổ sung thêm cái ý là thì về mặt gọi là truyền thống mà nói thì Việt Nam là có một cái truyền thống là lãnh đạo tập trung, cho nên là cái truyền thống đấy nó cũng có lẽ là nó sẽ ảnh hưởng một phần đến cái quyết định là sẽ nghiêng. Tôi thì tôi nghiêng về cái ý rằng là cái hỗ trợ các cái cơ quan quản lý, hỗ trợ các cái điện gió ngoài khơi này sẽ phải là một cái cơ quan trung ương phối hợp với các ban ngành với nhau và phối hợp với địa phương. Về phần địa phương mà nói thì thực tế về mặt chủ quyền thì điện gió ngoài khơi thực sự là nằm ngoài phạm vi cái sự quản lý của địa phương, vì nó nằm ngoài cái phạm vi hải lý mà địa phương quản lý ở Việt Nam theo cái luật về cái hàng về biển. Thứ hai nữa, tuy nhiên thì nó có một cái phần liên quan là cái phần mà đấu nối và điện gió vào các cái trên bờ, tức là khi chúng ta cần cấp điện trên bờ, chúng ta cần phải có những cái tuyến đường dây, xây dựng các cái trạm biến áp trên bờ, thì cái đó là thuộc phạm vi quản lý của các cơ quan địa phương, các tỉnh. Cho nên là chị lấy một cái ví dụ về cái này như là phát triển ngành dầu khí của Việt Nam chẳng hạn, thì ngành dầu khí cũng là trước đây là chúng ta chưa hề có. Thế thì cái dầu khí để phát triển ngoài khơi thì Việt Nam cũng đã thành lập một cái đơn vị tập trung về dầu khí chẳng hạn. Thế thì tôi nghĩ rằng là cái vấn đề này thì tất nhiên là cái chính phủ sẽ xem xét cụ thể chi tiết thì không dám, nhưng mà ý của riêng của tôi nghĩ là có một cái đơn vị tập trung quản lý tập trung trung ương và kết nối với các cái địa phương mà có các cái tiềm năng phát triển điện gió ngoài khơi để có thể thúc đẩy cái điện gió ngoài khơi xa bờ phát triển lên.
Thanks, Dr. Tuan. These are concrete recommendations, and the precision of these ideas is most appreciated. I think we'll continue this discussion to see how we can move things forward in this direction to have greater coordination through a national body. I'd like to answer another question which has come up a few times from responses, which is transmission challenges. And we've seen how the influx of new solar capacity has created concerns about curtailment issues and the pace of transmission build out meeting the pace of deployment for wind installations. Someone has asked a question about, given the scale of offshore wind projects, whether private investment in transmission could be enabled or supported by allocating an element of FIT pricing initially for this to cover transmission investment, and then later have this as a feature of auction design. Michael, I think looking at the research you and your team have conducted for the report, I'm wondering if you have any insights on transmission support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really, really, really pertinent question, especially for Vietnam, where the transmission, sort of the growth in the transmission required is going to be perhaps on a scale we've not seen in other markets where offshore wind has been developed. I think there's no, I won't be able to give sort of the silver bullet solution to that in a, on this webinar, and I think that's one of certainly the key studies that we think should be done. I think obviously we see from our work that different countries have taken different approaches, and this is certainly one where it's very specific to the market and the grid and the scale of the upgrades that are required. So where, for example, in the UK, there's perhaps a more established grid as well, and obviously the arrangement, the interplay of that arrangement in terms of who is responsible for things like the transmission costs. So in the UK, we have this OFTO arrangement, which is slightly different to, say, Denmark and Netherlands, where grid costs are perhaps bundled into that auction. Ultimately everything in those markets gets passed down to the consumer in one way or another, and it's just the avenue that it goes down. So I think the question and the suggestion is a good one, whether that be implicitly in a higher level of feed-in tariff, or explicitly through saying this will help to sort of bring on some private investment. I also think worth just to sort of finish off the answer. I think in Taiwan, it's interesting there was that more explicit basis where actually in that round 2, you had the selection process, which actually said it's not necessarily transmission, but it was around the supply chain and explicitly saying, okay, we're giving you a feed-in tariff, but actually that means that because you're getting slightly higher price for your electricity, we expect you to do X, Y, and Z in terms of local content. And at the same time, in the same summer, the competitive selection process resulted in a lower price, and actually the government acknowledged that because of that lower price, perhaps they weren't needing such onerous other investment in wider sort of infrastructure or in the supply chain. So I think there could be similarities there in terms of how that can be applied in Vietnam, but certainly I think that the ultimate recommendation is a deeper dive and study to the specifics of Vietnam, and it's a really contextual problem essentially. So.
Thanks, Michael. I think we could continue this discussion and take a deeper look at the Taiwan case and what it could say for Vietnam, but unfortunately, we're coming up against the hour. I do want to give everyone one last chance to speak before we go back into the deck and close the webinar down. So I'm going to initiate a lightning round of questions and ask each respondent to please keep their response to 30 seconds, adapting a question that has come in from the audience around the barriers for lenders, both local and international, to finance offshore wind projects. So in your view, what is one concrete step which could be taken in the near term over the next few years to really help to increase investor confidence and certainty in offshore wind in Vietnam? Maya, I'm going to start with you, and then we can move to Andy, Dr. Tuan, Li Ming, and Michael.
Okay, I guess if I was to kind of put it down into one step, I think the best thing to be done is just give a clear framework for awarding development rights, and like that will lower development risks, and that will get projects off the ground. On the financing curtailment issue, which is our biggest, I guess, hurdle when it comes to financeability of the PPA, is to support it by resolving the priority of dispatch. So normally in countries, you can have a law that says if you're renewables, you get to supply to the grid first, and you give the transparency and priority. And then this helps to solve some of your bankability PPA issues.
Thanks, Maya. So clarity on development rights, and then priority dispatch as a mechanism. Andrew, you.
Yeah, I think I would circle back into the sort of the genesis of this webinar. You know, the transition and the route to market that's being offered as well. You know, we started with the question on the clarity for November, December. I think that is probably the sort of key question. What is the sort of mechanism from there? And yeah, I think then from then it's then the process of the framework and how this coordination that we were speaking about earlier is going to happen. You know, I heard a call there for a centralized scheme, but I think, you know, whatever the outcome is, it has to be a very transparent, very well glued, very well communicated framework.
Thanks so much, Andy. Well said. Dr. Tuan, over to you for your thoughts.
Và tôi nghĩ rằng là đúng là được quan điểm mà để tăng được cái sự gọi là của các nhà đầu tư, cái độ tin tưởng của các nhà đầu tư để phát triển điện gió này, thì cái đầu tiên là đúng là cái cơ sở pháp lý. Cái cơ sở pháp lý hiện bây giờ nó cũng chưa thực sự, mà nói là nó cũng chưa rõ ràng. Mặc dù chúng ta có nhu cầu, chúng ta có mục tiêu rõ ràng, nhu cầu, chúng ta có tiềm năng là các yếu tố cần, nhưng mà để chưa đủ để phát triển thì phải có một cái cơ sở pháp lý rất rõ ràng về phát triển từng dự án, vì mỗi một dự án điện gió ngoài khơi đây nó là nhiều tỷ đô la, cần phải có một cái cơ sở pháp lý thực sự rõ ràng. Thế thì cơ sở pháp lý ở đây thì nó có thể là bao gồm là thứ nhất là cơ sở pháp lý để phân bổ các cái dự án, nó phải được có tính chất pháp lý rõ ràng. Thứ hai nữa, cơ sở pháp lý rõ ràng đó là cái cơ chế mua giá hỗ trợ cái giá điện của ngoài khơi này là như nào. Đấy là hai cái vấn đề chính. Tất nhiên nó sẽ còn rất nhiều các cái vấn đề khác, nhưng mà để mà tăng cái gọi là confidence cho các nhà đầu tư thì với hai cái điểm mấu chốt này mà được làm rõ ngay từ đầu trong vòng 2 năm tới, thì tôi tin chắc rằng các nhà đầu tư sẽ xóa được rất nhiều các cái nghi ngờ, các cái trở ngại, để mà có thể họ sẽ đã gọi là thực sự đầu tư vào thị trường điện gió ngoài khơi ở Việt Nam.
Thanks, Dr. Tuan. So we're hearing a call for clarity on selection and assignment of projects within the next few years, general clarity on the legal framework. Li Ming, 30 seconds from you, and then we'll turn to Michael.
I think I want to come back to this report and the purpose of this report, the transition, and really to ensure that the first generation of the project can really get built between now and 2030. And this is, as Michael just shared in all the examples that we've seen, all the countries started with a FIT or some sort of very stable kind of like supportive mechanism to kick this offshore market off before it switched to a more competitive kind of like mechanism. The only country which start off right away with auction is France, where they have lingered with only 2 megawatts of installation after 10 years of the first launch of the auction. So that really is a very strong evidence that supporting that we need a clarity on this and the transition. So that's on my side.
Thanks, Li Ming. So a supportive mechanism in place by end of year, kind of echoing Andy's point as well. Michael, final word from you.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with all the suggestions. I think my one would be the consultation element, and you're not going to please everyone all the time, but I think in offshore wind policy you can probably please most people most of the time, and being able to set out a a clear way for consultation to happen, not only with developers, but also with the supply chain and with other interested parties, sticking to that, sticking to timelines, and then delivering on recommendations, and being firm in that and following through on those, I think has been time and time again, has been a critical key to success in the other markets we've seen.
Great. And I think that sums up well a theme that has come out strongly from this discussion on transparency and consultative processes, and just stronger coordination, not just between government levels, as we spoke about before, but also between state and non-state actors, including investors as well as industry, of course. So with that, I'd like to close down the discussion, and apologies for running a little over time for this report launch. And we'll just say a few last words before officially closing down the webinar. So if we can get the deck back on screen. Perfect. So just a final note, please do download this report. It's free and for public access on the GWEC website. Has a lot of the considerations that were discussed today laid out in a very clear and narrative way, and lots of infographics there as well, which tell a story strongly about the relationship between these consultative and clear policy frameworks and a track record of sustainable growth and installations. So we do encourage you to scan the QR code and visit the GWEC website for the report download. You can go to the final slide, which is just our closing slide. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's report launch, and a big thank you to all of our speakers today for sharing their insights. It's been a fantastic discussion reflecting not just the challenges ahead for Vietnam, but also the tremendous opportunities to reap the benefits of offshore wind resource in the country. If you have any further questions on what was discussed here today, please do get in touch with GWEC or with RCG directly by visiting our websites. Thank you again for joining us, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.